attendees doing very, very different, very interesting things as well. So we're delighted to welcome you. I hope you and all your families are keeping safe and well. My name's Nikki van der Gaag, or van der Gaag for the Dutch in the room. I've been involved with the Young Lives project for quite a long time. I'm an independent gender consultant, but I'm helping the team to facilitate this webinar. And it was very much a joint creation, trying to think about the research that a number of the presenters are doing on marriage and divorce amongst adolescents, and thinking about it before COVID-19 and after COVID-19 and some of the consequences, and why we can't go back to normal. So it's organised by Young Lives and Child Frontiers, who are both part of the Young Marriage and Parenthood Study funded by the Canadian IDRC, and together with Girls Not Brides and GreeneWorks. So I'm really hoping this will be both I know there'll be some good presentations, and I'm hoping we'll have some good discussion too. So just briefly to introduce our speakers, Rachael is hopefully coming in on Gillian's WhatsApp from IDRC to kick off. And then Gillian Mann from Child Frontiers and Gina Crivello from Young Lives, who are part of the Young Marriage and Parenthood research, will present some of the findings from that, which was done before the COVID crisis. Chelsea will be presenting the research she did with Margaret Green and others from GreeneWorks on divorce and separation in child early and forced marriage. Rachael Yates from Girls Not Brides will be talking about their research, and they've been talking to a lot of their members and have produced a really wonderful post-COVID agenda for action that she's going to talk about. And then we're hoping to get in Mentrakam and Chandra Mooli just to talk a little bit about a joint WHO parliamentary initiative for 5 minutes before we go into the discussion. But I'm really going to keep people to time so that we have at least half an hour for discussion. You will have to put your questions into the chat rather than speak, because I think we're going to be too many people for a kind of to unmute people easily. And at the moment, as you'll see, you're all muted. I'm sure you're all familiar, probably far too familiar with Zoom by now. Chat box at the bottom. You can also send a chat privately to anybody, but do make sure if you want to perhaps ask a question that you have all attendees and panelists in the two sections so that we can see it. But I think it's really great that we try and make this as wide a discussion as possible. I find Zoom's not necessarily a very democratic vehicle, but let's try and make it as democratic as we can for the purposes of this. Emily Cracknell from Young Lives is co-hosting and is technical support. So do send Emily a private message if you've got any questions, technical questions, and she'll try her best to answer them. And we will be recording this. I hope that's okay with everybody. And then we can send you a link to the recording in the next week. And we'll try and also send you some links to other useful materials from the different organizations as well. So I think we're going to see if we can get Rachael in on the WhatsApp via Gillian to kick off the YMAPS, the Young Marriage and Parenthood Study presentation. Gillian, if you want to unmute. You're still muted, I think.
Did I go?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm sorry with these technical issues, connectivity, well, it's okay, but I can't access to the link. Nevertheless, thank you, Gillian, for this solutions. I've just to express my pleasure and the great honor to represent IDRC in this webinar on the marriage and divorce among adolescents before and after COVID-19, why we can't go back to normal. So for those who don't know, IDRC is part of Canada Foreign Affairs and Development efforts that supports research to generate knowledge, innovation, and solution to improve the life of people in the developing world. As such, so IDRC is very much aligned with Canada Feminist Policy Assistance, and we put gender equality at the core of our work. And that's why I think this work on ECFM is very much aligned to this framework, and we are engaged and supporting long, very extensive work on early and forced child marriages, and trying to focus on ending this practice. But as you all know, this practice survives. So there are marriage, young girls' marriage, and in the very less extent, young boys' marriage happen. It happens, and it's very important also that seeing that it's a continuum to explore what is about what the life of adolescents or young girls looks like in visiting marriage in general. That's why we supported this work. Which had been implemented in collaboration with Young Life and Child Frontier with other institutions in Peru, in India, Ethiopia, and in Zambia, to really get to know what are the issues where young people in this relationship are facing, and what kind of policy action can be generated from this. This project had been implemented now for 2 years now, and has there some critical insight that should be shared. Is what the intent of this seminar is, really to share this the knowledge that will be generated from the project, but also to think in this context of COVID, looking forward, what next? What are the next generation of issues, challenges that researchers and policymakers and even communities will be facing in this context of COVID. We know there will be there is a pre-COVID, there is a COVID, but there will be a post-COVID, and some early emerging analysis are pointing to the fact that this COVID will have an effect on equality, and we know that it affects everybody, but not equally. So it's very important for us to understand in this context of that that pandemic, which is very specific and very disturbing, disruptive. How what are the issues that can be in terms of research, policy, and practice from it, and also move forward the agenda for the rights and entitlement for girls to really be concretized. So on that, I will leave the floor to Gillian and Gina to give us the core of the findings from the project, and then from there, I think we'll discuss what next, the implication in the context of COVID, and hopefully participants will be able to contribute that we have not focused to factor in to really be able to research agenda from this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ramata. That's really kind of you to introduce that, and with those excellent words. Right, I'm going to just put up the first presentation. From the Young Marriage and Parenthood Study, and I'll hand over to Gillian and Gina.
Great, can you hear me? Excellent. Let me try to remove our faces. Wonderful. So I'm Gina Crivello. I'm with the Young Lives study based in the University of Oxford, and we're collaborating on this research on young marriage and parenthood funded by IDRC. So Ramata has covered much of what's contained in this first slide, but want to emphasize that this was a comparative study in Ethiopia, India, and Zambia. And just yesterday, we launched the comparative report and the comparative policy brief on the Young Lives website. So we really encourage you to take a look at that, as well as a series of blogs. And it's all based on the country level research that's been happening throughout this year. Next slide. Great. So we have about 10 minutes for our presentation on young marriage and parenthood. It aimed to shine a spotlight onto the relationships and households of married, cohabiting, and divorced and parenting young people, and importantly included both young men and young women. There were 3 broad research questions that we set out to address in these 4 contexts. The first is broadly around who marries and has children, why, and with what consequences for well-being, identity, and relationships. The second area was around how young people navigate their new roles, responsibilities, and relationships, and their experiences of accessing different services and sources of support. And the third area asks, how are their choices and experiences shaped by age, gender, location, different economic circumstances, and also by the changing social, cultural, and structural contexts in which they live, which very much influence ideas and definitions of good and bad childhoods and what a desirable adulthood looks like in these different contexts. So the data were collected in 2018, as Ramata mentioned, so prior to the pandemic. So in this presentation, what we wanted to do was highlight some of the points of vulnerability that we identified with this research in these relationships, on the assumption that COVID-19 is likely to exacerbate some of these negative trends. But we also want to emphasize the commonalities across the study sites, but also that child marriage is not homogeneous, and the practices are diverse and also changing. So first, I'll start by drawing out a few points on power dynamics within these households and relationships, and then I'll pass it to Jillian, who'll talk about why some of these relationships break down and some of the consequences. So first, we found that although both younger people and older people say that there's more gender equality now than in previous generations, in fact, young people's unions continue to be marked by unequal power relationships and by traditional household and caring roles. So that means young men are assigned the role of breadwinner or rice winner, and young women are responsible for the bulk of unpaid care work. And we know in the context of COVID-19, we've heard a lot about concerns that gender inequality is becoming further entrenched during the pandemic, as girls and women bear the brunt of additional unpaid workloads. We also found in our research that within these young relationships and households, young women's failure to perform their socially expected gender and domestic roles were a chief source of conflict, and that sometimes led to violence. And in the current crisis, there's already global concern that domestic and gender-based violence is rising globally. Next slide. Previous slide. Yes. So marriage and especially childbirth have the effect of intensifying female dependence on their male partners. Married and cohabitating girls and young women have limited decision-making power within their relationships across the board. And it's often husbands or male partners who make a lot of the household decisions, including whether their wives or girlfriends will stay in or return to school after they marry, whether they'll work outside the home, and also in decision-making regarding family planning. And although many young people wanted to delay having their first children until their early to mid-20s, young newlyweds often face intense social and familial pressure to conceive soon after marrying, which means these power dynamics of female dependency are amplified in the earliest phases of marital life. And boys and young men are also subject to these social pressures to conceive early within their relationships. So in the current crisis with lockdowns and travel restrictions, there are a lot of alarm bells warning that young people, and generally people, will struggle to access contraceptives, potentially resulting in millions of unintended pregnancies and unsafe abortions. So I'll pass it now to Jillian.
Great, thanks, Gina. Nikki, can you switch the slide, please? Super. I'm just going to talk very briefly about some of the findings from our study that relate to conflict within relationships and the breakdown of marriages and informal unions, which in the case of informal unions obviously didn't have paperwork associated with them, but they had the same kinds of ramifications on people's personal lives. In terms of the main reasons that we found for divorce and separation, there were a number that crossed all sites in all 4 countries. Although I have to say we're talking very little about India in this context, much more about Ethiopia, Zambia, and Peru when it comes to marriage breakdown and the breakdown of relationships. Some of the main reasons were, first of all, with respect to an unwillingness or an inability of the male partner to meet the economic and material needs of the family. Because as Gina said, some of the gender dynamics that dominated in the larger culture were sort of solidified and quite powerfully laid out within the relationship between adolescents in married households. One of the things that came very clear was men's role as provider, and this became very difficult in contexts where men were unable to meet that responsibility. Often there was a great deal of tension and frequently led to marital breakdown. The second reason across the sites was around perception or the reality of unfaithfulness within the relationship and a lack of trust. And that was both on men on the part of women and women on the part of men. And the third main reason was with respect to physical violence and abuse, usually experienced by young women at the hands of their husbands. And this was understood by most young women and their families who participated in the study to be an understandable reason for the breakdown of marriage. And the fourth main reason was when a young man normally abandoned a relationship, that is, left without discussing. Often it was to seek employment in another place, but sometimes it was because of a sadness or a perception that they were unable to meet the responsibilities that marriage brought, and hence, in the best interests of their wife and child, would leave that relationship. So one of the things that became very clear across all sites was that the ability of a young woman to divorce was really predicated upon the provision of support from her family. There wasn't a single instance in any of the sites amongst the divorced young women that we spoke to where the young woman didn't have a place to go to when she made the decision to leave or when leaving became her reality. So having a home to go to was a very important feature. Of course, it was a very complicated thing as well, especially when the young couple was a source of financial support to the girl's natal household or the household to which she was returning. Finally, access to formal services such as counseling, crisis intervention, and justice were really limited across all countries and the sites where we did the data collection. And there was a great deal of fear on the part of young people, both young women and young men, about using those services that were in existence, either because of the lack of confidentiality or because of the feeling that involving formal services would exacerbate some of the challenges that young people were experiencing. Can I have the next slide? Okay, great. This one is talking a little bit about the consequences of marital separation and divorce. I'm sorry, I'm kind of whipping through this, but we really do welcome you to read the report, which is uploaded now on the Young Lives site. So when we talk about the consequences across the countries of marital separation and divorce, one of the issues that became very clear to us was that it was quite common for relationships to end, not because there wasn't strong feelings of love or commitment to each other in a couple, but because poverty was so extensive that young people felt that they couldn't afford to have a separate household, that in fact they needed to return to their existing parental households in order to have their needs met. This is a little bit related to one of the reasons for separation and divorce, which I said earlier, which was the inability to meet the needs of the family. And one of the other consequences is, of course, separation from children in the cases where children went with the father or children went with the mother, it was quite a lot of distress on the part of parents, both fathers and mothers, of having been separated from their children. And very often the young divorced men we spoke to talk about this as one of the great sadnesses of their life, that they weren't able to be more engaged in the everyday lives of their small children. And another consequence is related to the reduced social standing and increased vulnerability. So that kind of goes with everything else in that becoming a divorced person was generally experienced as kind of moving down a tier of social status. To above, but cannot be underestimated in terms of the extent to which young women in particular, but young men as well, became much more reliant on their natal family for forms of support that they had been able to elicit for themselves in their independent relationship. And this created a lot of tension in households which were already extremely poor upon taking in a young woman and her children, or a young man and his children. All these things having been said, I think it's really important to point out that amongst the children and young people that we spoke to who had become divorced, for many this was really a welcome outcome. They argued that they had been living either in circumstances of great unhappiness, of circumstances of violence, or in relationships in which they felt really kind of stymied, and they really felt that by breaking up, they had enabled themselves to kind of open up new pathways in their life. And in particular, this was expressed by young women who had felt very confined to the home by their young partners, and in many cases were prohibited from seeking paid work. And so amongst those young women who were able to find income earning opportunities, divorce was really understood to be something that offered them a new path. Thanks to everyone. I'm getting these messages that my internet is unstable, so I'm hoping you're still hearing me. But we wanted to say thank you, of course, Gina and I, to everybody who's been involved in the study, of course, to IDRC and to the Government of Canada, as well as to our fantastic country researchers and leads. The names of everyone are here. What we're reporting here are the findings across the 4 studies. And of course, we relied on the great skill and support and collaboration of all these terrific people.
Thank you very much, Gina and Gillian, for that very comprehensive presentation in a very short period of time. Much appreciated. I'm going to move straight on for purposes of time to Chelsea, who can introduce herself. But Chelsea has been working with Margaret Greene and a number of other people on a piece of work looking at the kind of legal side of divorce and separations. I'm going to share her presentation straight away.
Great, thank you so much, Nikki. And thank you to Gina and Gillian for setting me up so nicely with the end of their presentation to talk to you a little bit about some of the work that we've been doing. What I'm presenting today are some ideas from a forthcoming policy and theoretical brief that GreeneWorks has developed. I want to take a quick moment to thank and acknowledge my co-authors, Margaret Greene, Seth Earn, and Madhumita Das, who are all online today as well, and also thank the Candida Fund for their support of this work. The initial idea came from work that GreeneWorks has been conducting in the past few years on synthesizing the evidence base on child early and forced marriage, which includes a forthcoming mammoth systematic review of evidence that was also supported by the Candida Fund, as well as recent programmatic reviews in Asia and Latin America. We wanted to acknowledge that we spend our efforts on preventing marriage and to a lesser extent on improving the conditions within marriage, but what if the most appropriate action is actually to leave marriage? We noticed in the evidence review that there's very little in the literature about access to divorce for married adolescents, And then going a bit deeper, we realized there's actually very little in the way of a feminist defense of the right to divorce generally. So we started by exploring that further. Can I have the next slide, please? All of this was, of course, kicked into high gear by the ongoing COVID pandemic. We're only starting to get a clear picture of what the impacts will be for adolescents, and particularly for adolescent girls, but what we do know is pretty terrifying. Based on the modeling released by UNFPA recently, we're looking at a projected total of 13 million additional child early and forced marriages in the next 10 years as a result of both the interruption of current program work to prevent marriage and the additional economic impacts. So the questions that we're raising in this brief might not be new, but they're pretty urgent. What can you do to support millions of married adolescents? You can start by empowering them to leave those marriages if they choose. If marriage is or should be a choice, then without access to divorce or other pathways for leaving, there's in reality no free choice being made. The right to marry and found a family implies a complementary and converse right to choose when and how to end a relationship that no longer suits or perhaps never suited one. So we asked ourselves, is there a human right to divorce? It turns out it's super unclear. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights refers to the need for equal rights at the dissolution of marriage, which may or may not imply a right to the dissolution of marriage. It hasn't really been further taken up, with the singular exception of the Maputo Protocol on the Rights of Women in Africa, which explicitly states that men and women have equal rights to seek or petition for divorce. So while we have some basis for our argument, the question of whether or not there is a quote-unquote right to divorce remains to be decided. But we also think it's moot, because where laws discriminate on the basis of gender, age, or other status, access to divorce becomes a human rights issue under the existing right to equality and non-discrimination. Divorce is legal in nearly every country, with two exceptions, the Philippines and Vatican City. But divorce laws all too frequently both reflect and reinforce existing gender and age-based inequalities. Many legal, social, and customary processes for accessing or instigating divorce are inaccessible to women, and particularly to adolescent women. And finally, as Gina and Jillian talked about, married adolescents are more vulnerable to violence and human rights violations within marriages, making the human rights argument for their right to leave all the more urgent. But we also know that family law, particularly as it pertains to divorce, custody rights, and property acquired during marriage, is still a minefield of gender discrimination in far too many places. These legal consequences are amplified by the social and economic consequences women face if they seek to leave marriages. Adolescents who want to leave marriage face social and family rejection or violence, legal prosecution. They may lose access to their children, they may lose economic security or opportunity, and the list sort of goes on from there. So next slide. So we set out to look at what potential pathways to exit are possible and which are accessible, and how for adolescents and young people married as adolescents. There's a lot of information on this table, so I want to pull out a couple of key points. We'll start with legal marriage. Just in terms of the numbers, the World Bank estimates that approximately 1/3, or 4 million, of child early and forced marriages each year are legal under their national context. From a law perspective, these should be among the easiest to leave. If the marriage exists and is recognized, then you should have the legal capacity, then you should have the legal capacity to petition to end it. Illegal marriages are also fairly straightforward. If the marriage itself was against the law, it's merely, quote unquote, a matter of getting it declared illegal and therefore void. And we've seen some pretty interesting progress on that in a number of different countries. Semi-legal marriages, however, tend to exist in the legal gray area, but have the social force of marriage and may be recognized or binding under customary religious systems. So here, the challenge is in getting the legal system to recognize these relationships as either valid or invalid and act accordingly. For informal unions, which exist entirely outside a legal system, the challenge is less in the pathway to exit and more in the confusion about the status of the relationship and whether there are associated rights or protections available to those who leave or are left. But this is all just kind of thinking things through from an idealized legal perspective. In practice, what we see is that for all of these pathways to exit, there are significant barriers to access for adolescents, particularly for adolescent girls, and legal systems tend to fail to protect their rights in pursuing exit, and they face significant economic and social consequences on top of whatever legal challenges they have. So next slide. So finally, as we were developing this piece, there were a couple of really interesting and key areas that emerged that we want to draw attention to. First, there's an incredibly interesting and dynamic conversation currently happening within these circles about differences in the age of consent to marriage, age of consent for services, and age of consent for sex. But what we see is that frequently, even where marriages under the age of 18 are illegal, married adolescents are not necessarily seen as adults by the legal system, leaving them in a situation where they've been treated as mature enough to get married and becoming adults by virtue of being married, yet they don't have the access to legal recourse consistent with being an adult once they are married. So we propose that by using the principle of evolving capacity, there's a precedent for treating married adolescents as adults, both socially and in access to services, such as family planning, which can occasionally be problematic in other contexts. But here, we should be able to apply a standard of evolving capacity that presumes, by the fact of their marriage, that married adolescents have gained the legal capacity to decide if they want to stay in the marriage or not, without negating all of the work that we've done to raise the age of consent to marriage legally. Secondly, I want to talk a little bit about gender, sexuality, and control. Here, the dynamics that contribute to significant gender differences in child early and forced marriage come into play. While adolescents of all genders are vulnerable to child early and forced marriage, marriage in itself is a tool for the regulation and control of sexuality, and therefore adolescent girls, and we can presume gender non-conforming and non-heterosexual adolescents, are more likely to be forced into early marriages in an attempt to channel their sexual expression into a more quote-unquote acceptable path. Marriage is part of a patriarchal system. It represents a shift in this control of girls' sexuality from the family to the spouse. And this gender double standard doesn't only apply to how and when adolescents are married, but also to what happens when they leave. Which brings in the issue of protection versus choice. Alongside this conversation about the role of gender and sexuality in access to divorce, there's some really interesting and emerging research around criminalization of sexuality and reproduction, in particular looking at how laws that are designed to protect people can, when applied in a discriminatory manner, be used to penalize those who make choices that go against the dominant norm. A really good example of this is spousal abandonment laws. These laws have frequently been designed and put in place to protect women from being abandoned, but they are also frequently applied in ways that increase gender inequalities. We see that women and girls who leave marriages are consistently threatened with or prosecuted for the crime of leaving a marriage. For example, Human Rights Watch found that nearly every woman and every adolescent girl incarcerated in Afghanistan is imprisoned for the crime of quote-unquote running away from a marriage, and we see similar trends in other countries. So I finally want to end with a little bit of a concern, but also a way forward. So while we're starting to see more focus on access to divorce in the literature on child early and forced marriage, and the YMAPS research is going to be incredibly important going forward, and this is great that we're getting more attention, it's frequently framed in terms of increased divorce rates being a negative consequence of high rates of child early and forced marriage. There's a red flag here in that while there's a certain political utility of pointing out that fewer forced marriages would likely result in fewer divorces, we should be careful not to fall into the trap of painting divorce as a negative consequence or social ill. Doing so only contributes to and magnifies the stigma against divorce, and therefore against divorced women and girls. Oh, sorry, I've lost my slides. Which will only continue to perpetuate the social consequences that can currently keep them from leaving marriages. You saw at the end of Gina and Jillian's presentation that when divorce is accessible and adolescents seeking divorce were supported by their families, that it was a welcome outcome. So we can be treating divorce, and we should be treating divorce as a positive outcome and looking at increases in rates of divorce as an indicator that adolescents, and those married as adolescents, are finally exercising their rights to free choice. Thank you again, and I'm looking forward to answering some of your questions during the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Chelsea. Sorry about the glitches there. Really interesting presentations, and we're already getting questions in. I'm going to hang on to them till the end because we've got one more presentation and then a comment from Chandra as well. So I will move straight on to Rachael Yates from Girls Not Brides to talk about their work with their members currently on the crisis and how that's potentially exacerbating some of the things that we've already been hearing about in the earlier presentations. Rachael, over to you.
Great, thanks very much, and thanks very much for inviting me onto this great panel. So what I'd like to do over the next 10 minutes is basically to look at some of the sort of emerging findings we have on the impacts of COVID on child marriage. And obviously it feels a bit sort of audacious even to say that when we're only like 2 months into something that could be having impacts over the next 2-3 years and beyond. But I think it's really important to start thinking through what we think are the causal pathways between COVID and child marriage, and how we can factor some of these issues both in the acute phase and during the response. So next slide. So a couple of months ago, we pulled together from some of the very early studies that were going out looking at COVID on adolescent girls, looking at some of the lessons from Ebola and other crises, what we understood about the likelihood of the pandemic impacting on adolescent girls. This was just really something to start a conversation like today with a number of different stakeholders. And we would anticipate as time goes by and we get more feedback from what we're hearing from members on the ground, we can add to this, but it's very much a conversation starter. Next slide. So you may be aware that there have been a number of pieces of analysis trying to sort of model the impacts of COVID on child marriage, and Emily mentioned one of these studies, which is the UNFPA study suggesting that an additional 13 million child marriage may take place before 2030, and that's as a result both of the lockdown and girls' inability to access a package of services, as well as potentially the economic impacts at a micro level, household level, and a macroeconomic level. In parallel, there is another bit of modelling taking place, which UNICEF are leading on with Tulane University, and I understand they're looking more at the Ebola data and extrapolating from that for looking at estimates. So at the moment, you know, a lot of these things are sort of not, I wouldn't say highly inaccurate, but they are sort of likely to have a lot of assumptions that we need to unpick, including the duration of the lockdown, the severity of access to impact on access to services, the size of the economic downturn, and so on. So I think to some extent these are real very initial estimates, although the methodology is set out in more detail and we can provide the links later. So in addition to some of these more modelling exercises, we've also been reaching out to a number of our members to understand the impacts that they're seeing, but also that they're anticipating. And this has been looking at a number of areas, including education, sexual and reproductive health, gender-based violence, and so on. So we sent a survey out to all 1,400 of our members, but we've also had a series of conversations with national partnerships and coalitions in about 20 countries. So these have been like Zoom calls like this. So in terms of the methodological rigor, it might not meet your high standards on this call, but I think it's been a really good way of ground truthing some of the anticipated impacts with what we're hearing on the ground. So next slide. So as we've also set out in the brief, there appear to be sort of 4 key pathways through which COVID is impacting on child marriage in the short and long term. Obviously, school closures is having a massive impact on girls' access to education. And we're seeing that these school closures are disproportionately impacting on the poor. And I'm sure many of you know from your own experiences, if girls are in fairly well-resourced schools that have access to online tutorials, that girls have computers and access to the internet, a lot of education can continue. But we know that most of the girls at highest risk of child marriage don't have access to these platforms. And even where they do, the cost of data is extraordinarily high. And that one of the things that we've also been talking about is how can we ensure we get sort of data, whether it's through those sort of scratch cards to girls that they can access information online. We also know that over time, the costs of education are likely to become more unaffordable, and a number of our members are worried that when schools reopen, the economic impacts on households will mean that many parents won't be able to afford to send backs to school, or where they have limited resources, the harmful gender norms will mean they'll prioritise boys over girls. So there's a real concern that the longer the lockdown goes on, the longer this, or the harder the impacts on the economy hit, the less likely girls will return. On health, we're seeing a number of impacts already, and our members report difficulty in accessing sexual and reproductive health services. That includes safe abortion, contraception, but also HIV testing services as well. And that was reported in a number of instances. We're also hearing lack of access to menstrual hygiene is a real problem and concern. Although, as an interesting adaptation, one of our members mentioned that some of their sort of work is supporting income generating activities around menstrual hygiene products. And the lack of psychosocial support services is also a growing concern, which when we consider the growing rates of gender-based violence, that is also a major concern. As you're probably well aware from your own context, there has been a massive spike in violence against girls and women during lockdown. And at the same time, we've been hearing repeatedly about concerns about access to helplines, to girls' shelters, police not acting on tip-offs if there is sort of reports of violence. In the main, we're also hearing that there is, overwhelmingly, our members are anticipating that there will be increased marriages as a coping strategy for desperate households, more as an impact of the impoverishment of households. However, we did hear in India that in the short term, the lockdown may actually sort of delay incidents of marriages. Obviously, the mechanics of arranging a wedding in shutdown is somewhat complex, but that's likely to really sort of increase once the lockdown is released. The sort of fourth pathway is very much around the sort of what we're hearing from our members around the economic impacts, with sort of massive concern about the lack of income impacting on the nutrition of households, that we're hearing that particularly amongst the most vulnerable populations, again from India, amongst migrant populations, slum dwelling communities, real concerns, and some reported increase in survival sex as a coping strategy. So again, the methodology may not be as robust as would be perfect, but I think we're getting a really sort of strong ground truthing of some of the impacts. So next slide. At the same time, and I think this is the sort of positive story, we're also hearing a lot of adaptations around programming and responses. And I think within a crisis context, it is supporting very much sort of partnerships and members coming together to look at how they can work in concert together, whether it's about adapting communications materials or pooling resources to do community level campaigns, but there's definitely that sort of mobilization going on at the community level. We're hearing some examples of community surveillance programs and setting up hotlines to report gender-based violence. A lot of work around sort of communication materials. So initially, although it may take the focus on direct child marriage work, but really using that on the ground capacity to do better communications with members. Some providing data to girls to access online resources and online learning. And a lot of work doing thinking through how to provide support to out of school girls with social distancing. So, I think this is one of the things we're really keen is to document how some of the tried and tested responses like work on life skills, comprehensive sexuality education, sort of groups can do it in a socially distanced way where they don't have access to the internet. Next slide. So just one very quick example, one member in Guatemala, they've been reporting how they've been coming together with others in a more sort of coordinated way. They work with married girls and girls in unions as well, reporting real concerns about girls living with their married girls living with their sexual assailants who can't escape. Again, concerns about the digital sort of divide and access to resources. So here, Mesa de la Niña have come together to form a subcommittee. They're planning campaigns together to help support work against unwanted pregnancies and reporting cases of violence. And again, it's this sort of social solidarity of the way that the feminist movement is coming together, which I think does give us hope for a way forward. So next slide. So I think there's some sort of broad recommendations which are set out in more detail in the policy brief, but I think within the sort of present crisis, still the need for a comprehensive approach. There's no one single magic bullet. It does appear that we do need to sort of focus in the short term, at least, very much on some of the economic drivers of child marriage. And I think there will be opportunities around some of the social protection responses coming out about how we can make sure these are more sort of gender responsive, and particularly looking at the needs of adolescent girls. So I think one of the challenges we face going forward is how do we bring together some of the economic responses with the work on social norms that we've been working on for many years. I think one of the other key things coming out that we need to consider life after COVID and life during COVID is, what does localization really mean? If we're all grounded in the global north and not able to travel around, the frontline workers are going to be those working at community level. How do we support them through flexible funding, ensuring that they have the ability to respond to the acute phase and recovery, and support them remotely with both funding and technical support. So final slide. I think that was it. There was one more. So I will leave it there for now, and happy to take any sort of questions on that later. But I think the sort of positive I take from this is that whilst this is an unmitigated disaster in many ways, there are opportunities to build back better. So I think it would be good to think about opportunities around supporting localization, shifting gender norms, thinking about how we engage across a number of different sectors to make sure that child marriage doesn't disappear off the political and funding agenda. And most of all, realizing that there is going to be a disproportionate impact on the most vulnerable girls, and thinking about how we really ensure girls are not left behind as we support girls with education, child protection, and so forth. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rachel. I thought that built really well on the previous two presentations, and it's really giving us some clear signs about what we need to look out for, but also some ideas about what's already happening. And I can see coming through the chat box as well, people are giving other examples of of documents, of initiatives
great.
that we can share in a little while. But
Fantastic.
before we do move to the discussion, we've got another 5 minutes, and I promised Venkatraman Chandramouli from the World Health Organization, who's worked on adolescent health since 1996, he could talk a little bit about an interparliamentary union and WHO initiative to engage parliamentarians to ensure that child marriage prevention and mitigation are not neglected in COVID. So Chandra, over to you. Do you want to just say hello and then I'll put your slides up?
Thank you, Nikki, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Great to be part of this webinar, and thank you for making a few minutes for me to share this.
Shall I put your slides up now?
So in the next 3 minutes, what I'd like to do is to
just finding them.
Share an initiative that we are starting with the Interparliamentary Union, and it really builds on points that all the speakers have made, but particularly Chelsea and Rachael. And while Nikki is looking for the slides,
fiddling, sorry.
I'd like to make the first point. And the first point is that 25 years after Cairo and Beijing, important progress has been made on child marriage. Important progress has been made in reducing the levels of child marriage, but even more importantly, for putting it on the agenda of the parliamentary agenda, of the SDG agenda, and that gives us an important handle to do things that we could not have done as easily during the MDG agenda. The next slide, please. So once a taboo topic with little or no public recognition, ending child marriage is now a social movement. This is one of the key messages of our Journal of Adolescent Health Supplement 25 years after the ICPD. And clearly this is on many agendas, but in relation to the point I'm trying to make here, it's part of the agenda of the Interparliamentary Union, of the African Union, of SAARC, of SADC, various groupings. So it's really on the political agenda. The next slide, please. Now, both these documents have been referred to by Chelsea and by Rachael. On the left, you see the UNFPA document and the estimates, the modeling estimates of what is likely to happen in the context of COVID. And then the document that Rachael took us through, looking at various effects listed on the slide. So lots of sense that the gains that we have made could be lost and are already being lost in the weeks and months of COVID. And what is becoming clear is this is going to be a very, it's not going to be one pandemic all over the world. It's going to be very different, both in terms of how it evolves and how in terms of governments respond. And so it's going to be a huge challenge, as Rachael said, in moving around both internationally, but even nationally to respond to it. The next slide, please. Now, one of the things that Girls Not Brides has said for several years is that parliamentarians are a key player. In much of the work we do, we engage governments, we engage NGOs. Parliamentarians are involved in discussions at the General Assembly, in the Human Rights Council, but much less in discussions on country level work. That's our sense from meetings with parliamentarians, both in Geneva when they come for meetings here and in country level visits. Girls Not Brides has set out some roles that parliamentarians could play. And that's what we hope to try to leverage upon in the next few months. My next and last slide. So WHO has a memorandum of understanding with the Interparliamentary Union. Since 2018, we moved from informal collaboration to a whole work plan that we are carrying out with parliamentarians on a number of issues. For instance, universal coverage is one of the key issues that both IPU and WHO are working on, and building on work that was started several years ago the IPU has preserved a place for child marriage prevention and response in its agenda. And so what we have done is we've secured some funding from WHO and the Interparliamentary Union to initiate an activity to work with parliamentarians in 12 countries that are priorities for the global program led by UNICEF and UNFPA, but this is open to engage with parliamentary groups in these countries, to give them a small amount of money to bring together groups and make sure that child marriage doesn't fall off the agenda. What we've heard is that money is going to come in a big way, and Rachael has pointed to a number of bottom-up activities that grassroots level groups could carry out. But what we want to do is to make sure that this is complemented with some attention to somebody at the national level, holding decision makers, holding lead NGOs into account, to make sure that child marriage issues are there on the agenda. And we may very well, Rachael, be able to work together to see whether the parliamentarians caucus, the feminist parliamentarians caucus, is able to work together with us to tie the threads of child marriage prevention, of sexuality education, of contraceptive access in a meaningful way, while it addresses the many other challenges that need to be addressed. So that's where we are starting. We're very happy to engage with others and to work with you on this. Thank you, and over to you, Nikki.
Thank you very much, Chandra, and thank you for keeping it exactly the length of time that you said you were going to. It's much appreciated. I don't know if panelists would like to at least show their faces again as we move into the kind of Q&A section. And I'm sorry we can't actually ask people to kind of unmute themselves. I think there's just too many people on the call. So I'm just going to go back, and we've got a lot of questions coming in. Please do look in the chat box, because we've also got a lot of suggestions and links to really interesting documents. We'll try and collect them all and send those all to you afterwards, but if you want to look at them at the moment. So I'm hoping I'm not missing anyone at the beginning, but I'm going to pick out a few questions here, and I will get through as many as we can. So the first one comes from Tirza Brown. So when it comes to an invalidation of marriages that directly validate applicable national laws, what are the considerations for the consequences of invalidation? I think this is one for Chelsea. Should they be able to choose to stay in that union even if it's illegal? Chelsea, I'll hand over to you.
Yes, absolutely. They should be able to choose to stay in that union even if it's illegal. The work that we're doing is around the importance of choice and free choice within the context of marriage and divorce. I think the broader question around considerations for the consequences of invalidation is something that also needs a little bit more careful consideration, in particular because we've seen examples of these sort of invalidation programs being done kind of from a top-down perspective, right? You convince a leader that invalidation is great, and then they go through and sort of invalidate a bunch of marriages in a wide swath, and then there needs to be follow-up to reintegrate those girls back into their families, to reintegrate those girls back into education, to make sure that they're not feeling the sort of social stigmas and social consequences of having been kind of exited from a marriage, whether that's with their free choice or not. So I'm happy to say a little bit more about that, but I want to leave space for the other panelists to answer questions as well. Sorry, Nikki, I think you're muted.
Sorry. So does the research about adolescents' access to divorce include the US?
It's a global review, so it doesn't particularly look at any country or region. We are drawing off of reviews that have been done, and of course the literature is much stronger on the global side than in the US, but we have actually included some research from the US as well.
Okay, and I think Madhumita has responded to that one, so I'm following down. Did you want to come in, Gina?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask when that might be available. I think we're all looking forward to seeing that.
Oh, you'd think I'd have prepared an answer to that, wouldn't I have? Presently. It will be available as soon as we can get it through the presses. And we will certainly be happy to send it out to this listserv if Nikki will be willing to support us with that.
Well, Emily, it will be in the team. So, yes, Meg Manumati, you're also part of this. You're welcome to add things as well, but you'll have to do it in the chat box, I'm afraid. So next question is from Katja. Did you find any mention of lack of RHR information and knowledge during the lockdown? I guess this is Rachael, really, in addition to the lack of services, Rachael.
I'm just looking, am I on mute?
No, you're fine.
Okay, that's fine. So yeah, I was just looking through some of the responses now. Most of the responses from our national partnerships were talking about sort of services more broadly around access to contraception, safe abortion in particular. I didn't see any mention particularly around lack of, say, comprehensive sexuality education. But again, that might just be limitations in the methodology, because we do anticipate that there will be sort of gaps there, in sort of considerable gaps in services. A number of people did refer to things like life skills and girls' clubs being suspended as a problem. And as they're one of the main sort of conduits for this information, then I guess we can infer from that that that's likely to be an issue.
Could I come in here, Nikki?
Of course, Chandra.
Last week we did a live Q&A with FP 2020 and the International Youth Association for Family Planning. And we had young people from around the world speak about the challenges that they were facing. You know, if you're a young married couple, there are difficulties, but there are means of getting the services. But if you're unmarried, then it's a big problem, because, you know, pharmacies are closed. And so one of the messages that we are trying to communicate is we have to learn from the AIDS from the world, 40 years of AIDS work, that simply telling people don't have sex is not enough. We need to give young people information about risks and teach them about what they could do, and to talk about masturbation in an open and positive manner. So, you know, make all these, a whole range of methods available, and especially talk about what you would do if you were unmarried and sexually active in this context. So contraceptive services are a big problem, even if you're a young married woman, as Gina and Gillian have said. But if you're unmarried, it's a particular problem now. Over to you, Nikki.
Do any of the other panelists want to come in on that? Because I know there's been a lot of work done around this area, both during and before the crisis. No? Okay. So there's another question from Nalini, which to address to Rachael, but again, I think somebody else could pick it up too. Please elaborate a bit on how difficulties in access to health services and increased violence against women at home are linked to increased likelihood of early marriage. What are the social and gender norms at play there? I mean, that's also a question for before as well as at the moment, I think. But Rachael, why don't you kick off? You need to unmute.
I think that, so the key issue here really is the lack of access to contraception, and I think Meg helpfully shared the UNFPA study looking at some of the likely impacts on lack of access to contraception, safe abortion, how that will likely increase the sort of unintended and unwanted pregnancies, and that in itself is likely to be a major factor in early marriages because of the harmful gender norms around sort of pregnancy and childbirth out of marriage in many contexts. So that's the sort of anticipated pathway there. And there are some innovations. I mean, in the UK now, it's now possible to get online to abortion pills that you can take at home, but I don't know how many countries are really adapting sort of access to safe abortion during COVID. So it would be interesting to hear other people's understanding, particularly around sort of access to contraception during COVID, and whether the lack of that is actually driving up child marriage from what they're hearing.
Does Gina or Gillian or Chelsea, would you like to come in on that at all? From your own research before the crisis?
Just to quickly say that across many of the contexts, there was often availability, but the social norms were so strong and the pressures to conceive early on that was a huge barrier. So I think in talking about providing the contraception or the access to the abortion, I think a whole other set of interventions need to complement that.
Yeah. And I think people again are suggesting things in the chat box. There's some very useful links going on from REMA on domestic violence, link to UNFPA's analysis. So do have a look at that, and we will try and collect it. And also people giving their own evidence around a surge of child early and forced marriages in Ethiopia already. Just having a look at some of the other questions. Yeah, I mean, some of the questions are very much comments, and I think it's really useful for us to collect them because they really will drive the way that adolescent marriage is going to be treated going forward. A question from Lazarus, I think it's probably going back to Chelsea again here. Is adolescents' divorce more of their right or due to external pressure, your families or peers? I think maybe Gillian and Gina could come in on that too. Chelsea.
Sure. So our work is around positioning the idea of a right to divorce in the context of child early and forced marriage. But I think it's clear from what we find that adolescents and married adolescents are under considerable family and peer pressure, largely to stay married rather than to leave marriages. And so a lot of the work that needs to be done, and I actually might integrate into this a response. There are a couple of questions in the Q&A about how programs can integrate access to divorce into their existing work, and I think that that's really where it lies, is that, you know, a lot of the stigma for divorce comes from the same social and gender norms that we see that drive child marriage, right? It's part of a system of gender inequality and a system of control of sexuality, and particularly control of adolescent girls' sexuality. And so you have to be addressing those social and gender norms and those social pressures in order to be ensuring that you're getting to a space where people are exercising agency or acting of their own free will when they're making choices and making the choices that they consider to be best for them given their context. There are a couple of other things that I wanted to say about integrating divorce into existing programs, in that there's some pretty easy ways. One is this idea of destigmatizing divorce, which has to be part of the social norm project that's already happening. But also looking at policy changes and ensuring that child early and forced marriage legislation around adolescent marriage in general considers access to divorce, and also that the policy environment doesn't discriminate against married adolescents. I think in particular, if you look at education policy, there's been a lot of really good progress on reintegration of adolescent mothers, adolescent parents, married adolescents back into schools, but frequently there tend to be these kind of protection gaps. I tend to use the example of Malawi, where there's a really strong reintegration policy for adolescent parents, but that reintegration into education is dependent actually on those marriages being canceled. You can't be married and in formal school in Malawi, which is a policy that's designed to encourage people to leave marriages, but it has the impact of discriminating against married adolescents. And so as long as you have discriminatory law and policy, then you can't really talk about free choice in the same way.
Yeah.
I'll turn to Gina and Gillian.
And Chandra, you might want to come in on that too.
Yes, please. You know, there was a point that Gillian made in her presentation that that sometimes marriages end not because of lack of affection or love between the couple, but because of economic reasons. And you know, in the last few weeks, we have seen these long lines of people for food parcels and soup kitchens. We shockingly long lines in rich cities like Switzerland, like Geneva, where only 3% of the people in the queue were Swiss. Most of them were people from outside. You know, domestic workers sans papiers, they say, without permits, who just received WhatsApp messages saying you're not required anymore. And that's really what is likely to happen to many young women. They'll be seen as disposable commodities, and not really a divorce, but an abandonment. Can't deal with you anymore, and so you please go your way, and that's a big issue. So they're nowhere in terms of where to go and what to do.
Yeah. Gina, Gillian, did you want to come in on that at all?
I would only jump in to kind of reinforce what Chelsea and Chandra have said, in that I think one of the things that we've seen so clearly is you can always have the right to divorce, but as long as it's unacceptable to do so, it doesn't make much difference. Just like you can have a law banning marriage, but as long as it's okay to do so, it doesn't make much difference. And I think that one of the things we saw so clearly was that familial support was really essential in order for a relationship to end. And in those instances where it wasn't provided, often leaving a relationship was posed a greater risk to the girl than staying within a relationship that was either unhappy or impoverished or violent or whatever. That there becomes a kind of either or. And as long as there isn't some kind of destigmatization of the breakdown of relationships, then you're going to have this problem. So I think the legal work obviously has to accompany lots of other discussions that need to be thought through really carefully. Although, of course, it's very important as a piece of it all.
Yeah, thank you. Lots of questions coming in. Rachel, I think you wanted to pose a question to the attendees about LGBTQI, non-conforming girls. Do you want to ask that rather than me ask it for you?
Yeah, no, it was just a question. I think it was in Chelsea's presentation. I mean, I can understand how it's very likely that there will be familial pressure for sort of non-heteronormative, because of non-heteronormative norms, to sort of push girls into marriage if they're LGBTQI. But is there any hard data on this? Because I think it's an issue that we think we're neglecting, that we think it's an issue, but I don't know what the state of the evidence is. So it's just really a question on that.
So if anybody has any ideas or thoughts on that, do put it in the chat box, and Rachel can pick that up. And Chelsea's also messaging me that, if there are, we've got a few more minutes, but if we don't get through everything, then the panelists will have a look through these questions and we'll answer them in writing later on, as part of the kind of feedback package we send you later on. So
if I might just, in response to Rachel's question, there's very, very little hard data. What we do know comes more from reports around violence and discrimination against gender nonconforming and sexuality nonconforming people, and sort of mentions of forced marriage as a form of discrimination and violence against these people. This is an area of particular interest for me. I've had some informal discussions with particularly trans groups in a number of different countries who sort of confirm my hypothesis a little bit, that there's likely to be, especially for gender nonconforming boys, that they're likely to be channeled earlier into marriage, again in that attempt to control their sexuality, to channel their sexuality into what's considered a more socially acceptable path to correct or fix their sexuality or their gender presentation. I would love to do more work on this. If any of the participants or attendees or anyone has more information on this, would like to potentially work on something related to this in the future, I would love to hear more about your work. I would love to be connected. So please do reach out. You can find me on Twitter at Chelsea Said So, or at my website, chelseasaidso.org. But please do reach out if you do have more information on this, because I think it is under-researched and we do need to know more about what's happening, but it's very, very hard to find because these are people that tend to disappear both from LGBT spaces and into child marriage spaces.
thank you, Chelsea. Well, it sounds like we're having a number of people sharing very concrete examples. So Ingrid's saying there have been significant challenges with access to contraception, at least in our region. I'm just checking which region that is, due to disruptions in supply chains. So the kind of knock-on effects, and similarly challenges in accessing abortion services, even in countries where abortion is illegal. So that nexus between legality and non-legality becomes even more kind of important in this sort of situation. Okay, I'm just going to try and pick up a couple more. Some people, yeah, please do read the chat because there's some really interesting examples. Yeah, and Madhumati, you've been working with Chelsea and Meg, I know, and you said the talk around divorce is completely out of all programs on CEFM, but more problematic is that when we work with adolescents, especially girls, we bring marriage discussion not as a choice, but as an important event that every girl would go through. This makes marriage as an institution stronger and establishes the fact there's almost nothing outside of it. Adding to it is the control over girls' sexuality, which other people have mentioned too, especially over her body. I think to Chandra's point, I think selling of girls will increase because of economic hardship, which will push girls' daughters into this by families. I think, Rachael, you mentioned that, but you also mentioned that in India, potentially the lockdown is preventing that because nobody's going out. So I don't know if anybody wants to comment. I think it's a really important point. I don't know if any of you want to comment on that.
Nikki, not on that, but on one issue that we haven't touched on is digital health. Supply lines are breaking up, and we saw even in places like Switzerland, no masks and no hand sanitizers, and grocery shops running out of certain food products. What you see in low-income countries is this beginning to happen. Rachael showed a couple of very interesting examples from Guatemala, and I'd like to share one from India. Love Matters is a site that provides edutainment on sexuality, on a number of issues. A very popular site. Tens of thousands of young people and adults access it. And they've started a new, Vinita Yadav, who leads that initiative in India, they've piloted and started an initiative linking people, their users, to providers of services in close to where they live. Something like, and they kind of vet and certify these delivery points, very much like what we do with hotels. I'm going to share with you what they're trying to do. And I think this is, although not everyone has digital access, and this cannot solve many of the problems that have come up in the chat, this is an innovative, bottom-up approach to using digital technology cleverly.
Thank you. I just wanted to pick up on so many things coming in now. We always need longer. But Meg Green wanted to say that the whole point about divorce being viewed as distasteful to work on, since nobody wants a divorce. So despite it's being an essential backdrop to choice, I don't know if any of you want to say something a bit more about that. That in some ways, young people are kind of really caught, aren't they, between a rock and a hard place in those situations.
Very quickly, what was interesting about the comparative aspect of our research was sort of the contextual differences. And in Peru, for example, many of the young women, when talking about their experiences in these relationships, mostly cohabitation, there were very few formal marriages. And they said very clearly, we don't really want to get married formally because it's so much more difficult to leave a bad relationship. And in Ethiopia, also working in very diverse contexts, there was a sort of contrast between two communities. One where there was very little support to work with couples who were experiencing conflict. It really was all down to the family, which was, in some ways a benefit, but really left them lacking to sort of solve their issues, and left a lot of the girls less protected. In another community, there was very strong community structures that were beginning to come into place. But in some ways, that was preventing young women from leaving marriages that they wanted to leave, because those structures were quite strong in trying to keep those unions together.
And there is clearly a link there between divorce or separation and how you support young married people, as well as obviously wanting to prevent those marriages in the first place, but when they've actually happened, how do you support them? And divorce might be one way of supporting them. So Ingrid's just told me she's from Bangkok, so that's very useful. And I just wanted to pick up on Nalini's point from ICRW Asia. Partners in Jharkhand in India, although early marriages are on hold right now, grassroots NGOs expect to see the incidence of early marriage rise sharply after lockdown is lifted, and that's something I think we, linked to economic security, consolidation of gender norms. Yeah, and girls are now disconnected from school and back in the home. So really important to be looking at some of these things and thinking about how we can deal with them. Rachel, you wanted to come back to Nalini's point as well.
Yeah, no, I think this is sort of tells very much what we're hearing as well. And I think the sort of policy response, and one of the things that we may also want to explore as a research community is, are there things like cash transfers that can be introduced to actually help girls back into school? I mean, as we know, the evidence on cash transfers, conditional and unconditional, on child marriage is a bit mixed, and conditioning on marriage in India, I think, was not a huge success. But whether we should be sort of pushing for things like conditional cash transfers based on girls returning to school. And there's some quite interesting work, I think DFID are funding, on gender responsive social protection, where they're looking at different types of cash transfers, looking at the conditioning, the targeting to be more gender responsive. So this could be something, with all the billions going into social protection programs as part of the response, that we could be exploring in a bit more detail. So if anybody's working on that, I'd be interested to hear from them.
Okay, I'm afraid we're going to have to stop, and I'm sorry, Mona, Becky, Ali, several of you have very more interesting points that we'll try and answer afterwards. I just wanted to give you each a minute if there's anything else you wanted to add before we finish from the presenters.
30 seconds.
Okay, good.
Just to reflect on the panel, it was really interesting. I think I learned a lot. And I think what I liked was that it looked across the child marriage pathway in some sense. There's a big focus now on the prevention within child marriage field in the current context. And what we've tried to highlight are the everyday experiences of those already in relationships, and also experiences of divorce and separation. So while we need to be really looking at those issues of prevention in this moment, we mustn't forget those millions of young men and young women already in relationships, some of whom want to remain in their relationships and need support to do so.
Thank you. Who else would like? Anybody else would like to just say a final word?
Yeah, I want to kind of second that a lot of this comes about because we are looking at those millions of adolescents already in relationships, and making sure that when we're talking about child early and forced marriage, that our programs and our advocacy are extending to include them and include their needs and their choices in what we do. But I also just want to kind of end by elevating Madhumita and Meg's points, of course, about really this is about the role that marriage plays in society and the incredible social pressures that adolescents face to value marriage, and the gender distinctions in how people who leave marriages are treated. And so if we're not addressing that as part of the work that we're doing around gender inequality, then we're not necessarily getting to a place where people have that element of free choice. And I think that's especially important when you're talking about marriage and divorce and the role that marriage plays in our culture.
Okay, thank you very much. Chandra.
Yeah, without a doubt, the COVID-19 is going to affect young people's lives in many ways, as Rachel has said, and we all know. What we also want to see is that as resources come in to address this, and resources are beginning to come in a big way in many countries, we must make sure that girls and child marriage are not sidelined. And so while we focus on these problems, we also must make sure that we work in a coordinated way to ensure that resources are used, and that we go to people who can make a difference at the national level, all the way down to the local level, and make sure that good things are done, and some of the good things that are done are institutionalized for the future. Thank you,
And
Nick.
I think a number of people have also been raising the issue of humanitarian settings that we won't have time to get into. That's obviously really important. Who else hasn't had final word or wants to? No, if not, I'm going to thank everybody very much for participating. I think it's been an absolutely fascinating discussion, and you, both in the chat and the panelists, have raised so many interesting and important questions. And we'll make sure that we send you a video of this, and also that we try and answer some of your questions in writing. But also, we're going to save the chat and do a kind of edited version of that to send you, so you can follow up on all the fantastic ideas that have been coming in the chat box. So thank you very, very much, everybody. Much appreciated. And yeah, have a good afternoon, evening, morning, wherever you are.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thank
Do
you.
reach out if you have stuff you want to talk about. We're really happy to engage.
Definitely.